and welcome back for lesson 4, which is entitled Us. Like any animal, human, or organization, the Methodist Church is a structure. Okay? It's conceived of and held together by different rules and practices, things we all agree on, and in some cases even some things we don't agree on. The basic structure of the United Methodist Church begins with the local congregation. We'll return to the structure of our own church at some other point, but for the purpose of our study for today, the Methodist Church begins with the local church. When you move up from the local church, the churches are organized into groups called conferences. Conferences are often subdivided into districts. So we are, and see, I won't go into districts too much, but we are in the Desert Southwest Conference, and we are in the West District. We're the most northern church in the West District is Sedona, so we're actually just in the West District. Conferences can arrange themselves in all sorts of different ways, with as many districts as they need and all those support systems in there. They often have a rule book for conferences called conference journals. These are selective rules for that particular conference. But we also have a larger rule book, and that's called the Book of Discipline. The Book of Discipline is a document that changes in some ways every 4 years. But the Book of Discipline does define how many churches need to be in a conference, how much membership in that conference can support a bishop. Okay? So you have a conference, and a conference is overseen by a bishop. Conferences may or may not follow state lines. It's weird, it's funky. Oftentimes, when a conference draws its boundaries, it has more to do with local politics than anything else. In the case of our conference, the Desert Southwest, we have the entire state of Arizona and then Las Vegas area. I think that geographically that makes sense because Las Vegas is fairly easy or a shorter distance to get to with Arizona than California, but I don't know. I really don't know the internal reasons for that decision. But conferences are then organized into regional bodies called jurisdictions. Jurisdictions are given a number of conferences. I don't know that there's a specific number that has to be in a jurisdiction, but this jurisdiction, for instance, includes California, Colorado, Montana, I think Idaho, Washington, Oregon. Basically, it's the entire West Coast. It's the Western jurisdiction. My home conference in Pennsylvania, that's the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference. It's just the eastern part of Pennsylvania. The whole state's divided into 3. And then all 3 of those are part of the Northeast jurisdiction. That's everything from Maryland all the way up through Maine. So that's how some of these conferences are formed. As far as decision-making processes are concerned, it's a little harder to talk about who makes what decisions. And most people who are really excited and interested about that are people like me. So I'm not going to bore you to death with that. The important part you need to know is General Conference then oversees Jurisdictional Conference. General Conference happens every 4 years, and it's the only body which can actually speak for the Methodist Church. The bishop kind of oversees that the rules are being carried out, for lack of a better way to put it. The general church, if something happens, they're the one, General Conference, they're the one that is supposed to say something. Obviously, you can tell how often that happens because they only meet every 4 years. So we're not the most responsive when it comes to global issues in that respect. We do have different agencies within the broader denomination that can respond very quickly, and that's part of the way our setup is. A bishop does not have voting ability at General Conference. If someone becomes the bishop, they are basically outside of the entire decision-making process. They just oversee. They don't make the decision for us, which has its positives and it has its negatives. I'm going to get into that a little bit more because I need to explain the clergy leadership structure in the Methodist Church. Because you've probably heard me from time to time mention different types of pastors. And here are some of the different titles you will hear in the Methodist Church. A local pastor, a deacon, elder, district superintendent, and bishop. Those are usually the 5 most common you will hear. A local pastor is someone who receives extensive training within the Methodist Church and is able to minister to a local congregation. Often these individuals have other jobs. Sometimes the church is their full-time job. Many times it's their second career. While these pastors receive extensive training, not all of them have the same education amount as an elder or a deacon. Okay? So, by example of that, both of my parents are considered local pastors. Louise Cordova, she is considered a local pastor. So these individuals, they add a tremendous amount of knowledge and passion into doing the ministry. They just may not have been educated as much as someone like myself. And that's not a detractor, and I'm not trying to downplay or anything like that, just trying to show where some of those differences are. But before I keep going on that, a deacon. What is a deacon? A deacon is someone who feels called to serve the church in some capacity, but outside the Methodist Church. A great example of a deacon would be someone who believes they're called to be a social worker. And they receive a degree in that, or maybe a counselor, right? They seek a degree in that, they receive that degree, but they also then go to seminary and receive a higher education degree in religion, such as an MDiv or Master's of Religion. And they become a deacon in the church. So their other job is full-time, but they get assigned to a church to help that church as well. Deacons are really tasked primarily with working outside of the church. Elders, on the other hand, are tasked with working inside the church. And elders are individuals who are fully trained with a seminary education to provide leadership, theological guidance, and counseling and things of that nature to the local church. I'm an elder, all right? A key difference between local pastors and elders: my parents, if they came out here, they could not do communion for our church. They are allowed to do communion in the churches they serve. Me, I can go anywhere. I can serve communion wherever I want. That's just one of those rules that are there. As an elder, I can be called upon to do communion, weddings, funerals, baptisms. I can take this show on the road. I'm not going to, but I can. I'm giving a very bird's eye view of these different roles, but an elder is really tasked with managing the life of the church. So all of my education has gone into that activity. It also means when I became an elder, so any Methodist church, whether it's a local pastor or an elder, these individuals are processed to a high degree. Okay, we receive psychological examinations, we receive regular coaching and counseling, things of that nature. I think for me that's important to share with you because unfortunately in Christianity there's many churches that don't expect that of their leadership, but the Methodist Church does. Now, some of the differences between local pastors and elders really does come down to theological hair splitting. We're talking minuscule differences. And I'd be lying to you if I said I agreed with all the differences. But I don't make the rules. I just try to help vote for better ones sometimes. District superintendents. Now, district superintendents and bishops are a little bit of a different ballgame. Those are positions you don't educate separately for. Those are positions that an elder receives. A local pastor and a deacon cannot be a district superintendent or a bishop. Again, I don't make these rules, they're just the way they are. Both of these positions come from elders, and the reality is the district superintendent is no different than me. I'm an elder. We're on the same level playing field. The only difference is the bishop can't be everywhere, right? The bishop's tasked with keeping an eye on the local churches in a conference. And just, there's no way. You can't be at 400 and some odd, actually this conference is 140 some churches. There's no way you can be everywhere. So the assumption is when a district superintendent comes, that person is a representative of the bishop. So if they tell me I'm doing something wrong, it is like the bishop telling me that I'm doing something wrong. So they're always acting on the bishop's behalf, or I should say at the bishop's instruction. It's kind of the way if you have a babysitter. I know I'm being tongue-in-cheek. If the babysitter tells you no, they're speaking for your parents. That same type of idea. The babysitter may not agree with your parents not letting you have the second bowl of ice cream, but they're still going to say no, or whatever the case might be. Now, bishops are responsible for calling together the pastors into pastors and laity. So laity is a fancy term for members of the church, for annual conference. An annual conference that happens every year, and we talk about the business of the church. We talk about some rather mundane things like health insurance and retirement stuff. But then we talk about social issues facing our conference and facing our world, and finding ways as an entire group, entire conference, to adapt. You can certainly ask me more questions about this type of structure, because this is very, very basic understanding of what happens, and there's all sorts of little ins and outs and loops. But again, I would like you to go to the Desert Southwest Conference webpage and to just kind of troll around on there. Just poke around, look around, see what you can find. There's all sorts of information and resources on there. But I want to move on to something else before we wrap up this lesson, and that is, what at its most basic level does it mean to be a church? What are the basic actions that we have in common? Well, some of those things are worship, music, weekly worship I should say, music in the worship space, communion, baptism, and the social principles. That's the first time I'm mentioning those for these lessons. But these are things that we as Methodists all participate in and agree to. So for instance, communion and baptism are commonly shared with other churches, right? You can be an Episcopal and have communion and baptism, or a Catholic and communion and baptism. They are different. There are actions that we all read the New Testament and said Jesus wants us to do these things. And of course, though, we have some kind of unique Methodist ways of seeing and viewing these. Again, I'm talking very broadly, and I'm taking communion as an example. There are some people who take communion very, very seriously. They believe when I stand up there and say those words I do before communion called the Great Thanksgiving, that the bread and the grape juice literally change somehow. God does something and it changes. And, that's a very, very high view of communion. Because then you have other people in the Methodist Church who just see it as a symbol. The bread is a symbol of Christ's body, and the grape juice is the symbol of Jesus' blood. Guess what? In the Methodist Church, they're both right. You can have both views of communion at the same communion service. it's really cool to be able to say that. It's also, as a pastor, as an elder, it's a little difficult sometimes to come around because we have different attitudes about those things. But then, here's another example, baptism. It's perhaps in some ways one of our most unique practices as Methodists. We do infant baptism, which isn't uncommon, and some groups are really against it. But when we do baptism, we talk about a theological concept that's really unique to being Methodist, and that is called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is the idea that long before you ever understand it, God's grace is at work. So when we do a baptism, we remind everybody that in this baby's life, God is already working, which is really cool. But it's really a uniquely Methodist way to approach it. The last thing I want to address briefly is the social principles, and I really want you to look those up. I'll try to provide a link for it, or maybe if I'm able to scan the documents and have it aside. I found, in my experience being in the church, too many of our Methodist churches ignore the social principle, and that's not good. The social principles are some of the most innovative parts of what it means to be a Methodist. From our very inception, John Wesley was always at the forefront of different social issues of his day. Combating racism, combating unjust prison systems, trying to help the poor learn to save money and work harder, trying to provide health care. John had a very advanced view of women in the ministry, especially when later compared to the Methodist Church and how we didn't ordain women for the longest time. Just look up Susanna Wesley, which is John's mother. You know, this is part of who we are. In the early 1900s, there was a major problem with child labor laws. I know many of you are familiar with those. The Methodist Church was at the forefront protesting child labor laws and saying, we can't do this. We were also at the forefront of temperance, banning alcohol. We have all sorts of things, social grab bag in our history, but it's really important because our belief is it's not just about being Christian, it's about doing Christian things. And the social principles help us to see that. Now, obviously, we're just scratching the surface of this type of thing, and I want you to explore these in more depth. In particular, I really want you to explore the social principles, because I think that's a guiding, it can be a real guiding document for many of the things we struggle with today. So at either in a separate link, or maybe I'll put a slide at the end of this sermon, or maybe even right now, I don't know. I haven't edited yet. I'm going to include a number of scriptures I want you to look up. And I want you to look at them through the lens of everything I just talked about. It is saying something about worship or about baptism or all sorts of things. There's one particular passage in the Gospel of John I want you to look up and pay attention to how different people were worshiping. Okay? Because I do believe that's important, especially in this time where we are so disconnected. We're doing everything through the camera right now. It's important to realize worship isn't always what we think it is. And I would like you to examine one very popular hymn in the Methodist Church. It is the first song in every United Methodist hymnal, every Methodist hymnal that ever comes out, and it's "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing." It was written by Charles Wesley himself, and it is a testament to quite a bit of what we believe as Methodists. So if I can get some links on that, I've seen some pretty cool versions over the years. So work on those things through this week. Take out your journal, write scripture down that you look at, the reference, and then write what you think. Look up some of the terms I've talked about.